Schopenhauer argued that the noumenal will was the progenitor of all reality, and as such, its impersonality was detrimental to its creations, namely us. The great philosopher concluded that art, music, and fellow feeling, or empathy, were inversions of the will in practice. That is, one could choose against the base instincts of the metaphysical will. This is a little like tuning a radio dial between radio stations and listening to the static. In other words, by rejecting the ego of the self, as through Buddhist or Hindu meditation, for example, one may empty oneself of willing and enter an enlightened state, where the mind is temporarily emptied of utility, yet receptive of insight, which weirdly emerges out of the radio static. This makes insight nonverbal in nature, in that it prefigures reason. Hence, the primed individual becomes the vessel for genius, where he or she is emptied of all but the perceptual moment itself. Remember from our previous letters, Kant's transcendental interface sits atop the noumena and gives structure to all experience. Judgment arising from this screen may be compared to the shadows on Plato's cave wall. The eternal forms that cast the shadows are only imperfectly realized by the cave dweller who sees them. Because Kant, unlike Schopenhauer, was ambivalent towards the thing in itself and declared it unknowable, Hegel took this as permission to jettison the concept entirely. He kept the transcendental ideation and made it effectively an end in itself. In other words, all reality is a collection of ideas. And because ideas can be organized rationally, this makes rationalism the driver engine of reality. Ideas move as by divine locomotion through Hegel's dialectic. Hegel, like Kant, as Schopenhauer saw it, runs afoul of over-intellectualizing on the back end of something where the front end is pre-rational. One can only think he would conclude the same judgment of those who believe AI, artificial intelligence, will arrive at general intelligence through a computation of data. Perception is analog and not digital.
Dear Grasshopper, nothing about a mouse in a cupboard resembles a piece of wood with a metal spring. Yet the mousetrap, as a creative solution to a pest, arises out of the ether of the imagination so seamlessly, it is easy to forget the profound process in arriving at it. We begin with logic and tautologically deduce 4 from 2 sets of 2, and from there proceed step by step to greater and greater understanding that defies all logic. H.G. Wells once referred to logic as a form of stupidity and compared it to a serviceable suitcase with a loose handle. Poincaré argued mathematics relies on intuition and not logic. Einstein made a similar case for creativity over intelligence. In short, the undertaking of divining a mousetrap from a mouse eludes scrutiny, for the seeker cannot seek his seeking, and the finder cannot find his finding. Inside may be compared to an exposed photographic plate connected to a telescope. Logic needs only the brightest stars to make its points, so opts for the shortest exposure time. Intuition waits a little longer on the hunch more is there than meets the eye, and consequently plucks out a few nebula. Genius leaves the plate in place the longest, and aims away from the stars into what most would regard as a pointless void. With patience, it dredges up countless galaxies, and fills the plate with more light than darkness. In every surface, no matter how unpromising at the outset, countless universes await to be unearthed. Nietzsche boldly defined genius as seizing chance by the forelock. To create new worlds in this way demands new eyes, in a giant's grasp with small, careful hands.
Empathy may generally be described as the highest good. Schopenhauer saw this virtue as arising from the will being split in half, in perception by the duality of mind and matter. Paradoxically, in this example, will is looking in a mirror and seeing itself in the guise of another, so chooses against its own annihilation, as when someone lays down their life for another without thinking. In a larger sense, will is conflicted, and so the great philosopher saw value being wrestled from its confusion. Schopenhauer gets at virtue, somewhat cynically, through a negative premise of will denial. Still, this value exists prima facie without requiring a rational defense. You know it when you see it. In this, Schopenhauer was right. One could perhaps accuse him of semantics, for in choosing against the will, one is still choosing, and choosing is still a form of willing. One might describe this as a counter-will, if one were inclined to see this will as bearing the likeness of God, in whose image we are fashioned, and to whose image we aspire. It is no great leap getting from an impersonal will to a personal God via transcendental ideation. Even Schopenhauer, who was not a believer, saw value in those world religions that devalue the self for the greater good. Schopenhauer's greatest accomplishment, as Omar sees it, was in understanding how nonverbal perception overrides intellectual axioms and dictates. But instead of the will accidentally creating value from self-contradiction, no sleight of hand is required. Our immaterial souls comprehend value through a glass darkly, and so intend value deliberately. God is the thing in itself, outside our prism of duality, and through his will, through his divine personality, he becomes the guarantor of all value.
Dear Grasshopper, logic being self-referential cannot impart value. Value is viscerally closer to the domain of feeling, even if our causal mind tells us the opposite. When we say something is true or false, what we generally mean is that it is right or wrong. Thus, our every fact is tainted with a measure of the proselytizer's moral rectitude. We modify one mental abstraction, the world, with another, morality, and never tire of our disappointment. Yet it is well to remember that wishful thinking, blissful ignorance, and selective amnesia are instinctual to man. In his categorical imperative, Kant argued that we should commit every act to the world as if we would wish it as a universal rule. Hegel, in response, pointed out that if we gave our money to the poor and wished it universally as a practice, then eventually we would be poor or the poor would no longer be poor. Either way, the imperative would cease of necessity. This, however, does not negate the impression that Kant's imperative feels right, even if it makes no sense as a practical matter. Hence, value is transcendental, not logical, and to utter it is to invite contradiction as the price for making intelligible to the mind what makes sense only to the heart. We may draw arbitrary lines designating a beginning and an end to satisfy ourselves, yet infinity supplies an endless regression of prior justifications that we abandon in exhaustion. Still, our heart is the dog wagging tail, unacknowledged in every debate. For good or ill, it colors every lens through which we attempt to view the world, not because what we see is true, but because of what we remember is true. In short, we act on a world with a memory that is more real than the world itself, and in occasional, unintended ways, are ennobled by it.